This is Understanding Europe, brought to you by CEREM, the Centre for European Research in Maastricht.
Ce premier marché commun, ces premières institutions supranationales, c'est l'Europe qui commence à s'unir.
Hi, been a while since you heard my voice, and if this is the first time, thank you for joining us. I'm Brendan Hogan, and my co-host is Charelle. Welcome to our first episode of 2024. In this episode, we're diving into Belarus, the Eastern European Partnership, and democracy promotion as a whole. This is the first part of a three-part series looking into democracy promotion in the Eastern Neighbourhood, Southern Neighbourhood, and within the European Union. Today we're joined by Wicke van den Broek, and you might be wondering where my co-host Charelle is. And that's where we're going to start. On the 25th of February, they went to Poland to conduct research for Embrace. More on that later. But while there, they gave us a little bit of context for our episode today. So I won't keep you any longer. Now, it's off to Charelle, and we'll be back here in a bit.
Et bon après-midi, bienvenue à bord de votre vol Brussels Airlines à destination de Varsovie. Veuillez prendre le siège indiqué sur votre carte d'embarquement.
Welcome back everyone to season 2 of Understanding Europe. This is your co-host Charelle, and today I'm with my colleague
Wicke van den Broek.
And we're just arrived in Poland on the 25th of February, where on the same day the neighboring country Belarus is having their parliamentary elections. You might be asking yourself, why is this relevant to Poland and why is it even important? Frankly, I'm asking myself these questions too, but luckily Wicke here is an expert that can answer these questions. So could you tell us why we're in Poland?
So hello everyone, welcome in Poland. We are here actually for research, to conduct interviews with people who are related to democracy promotion, the topic of our podcast, in Belarus, which is in the region of today's episode, so Eastern Europe.
And what's the relevance between the elections happening in Belarus and Poland?
So first of all, of course, Poland is a neighboring country of Belarus. It's the biggest neighbor, at least on the western side. Yeah. What's the relevance for Poland in terms of these elections is that actually after 2020 a lot of Belarusians came to Poland. We are in Warsaw today. Most of them live in Warsaw. It's about 300,000 people. And these people are actually not allowed to vote this time in these, what are called in international media elections, but which are not real elections. They are neither free nor fair, nor are they general elections, because indeed, as I said, people from abroad are barred from voting this time. And so these elections, they are not for everybody, and in fact the opposition, the democratic opposition of Belarus, called for Belarusians inside the country to boycott this event today. So we're in Poland, we are gonna host some interviews and gonna navigate the traffic here, because I think, as you can hear, it's pretty wild. Warsaw is a busy city of, quite frankly, a quite busy nation, so I'm looking forward.
And I think during the episode we're gonna delve deeper into the role of the Belarusian diaspora and the efforts of democracy promotion from the EU side in Belarus, and we're gonna go deeper into also into your research. But for that, we need to go back to Maastricht, so stay tuned everybody and see you in the studio.
Back to the studio.
Welcome both of you back into the studio, back in Maastricht, from your trip eastward from here, but very much still in Central Europe, as the Polish would be happy to know.
It feels good to be back. Good to be back in the studio and good to be back in season 2. And here we are recording our first episode of season 2 of Understanding Europe, so it feels good. But thank you, Wicke, for making the time and coming to this recording. I'm sure we're going to have a really nice conversation. When we were in Poland, the elections in Belarus were happening, the parliamentary elections. And it's been a couple of days now since the elections went down. But before we talk more about it, maybe first we would like to introduce your work. And maybe you can tell us about your research and your position at the Maastricht University.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charelle. Thank you, Brandon, for inviting me.
it's quite an honor, and I look forward to our conversation as well. We already had quite a few in Poland, and I think we can continue them here in Maastricht. So my position in Maastricht is that I'm a PhD candidate. My research is about EU democracy promotion in the neighborhood broadly. So at Maastricht University, my research concerns EU democracy promotion in the wider neighborhood, but at Maastricht University, together with Giselle Bos, my supervisor, our country case study is Belarus. And the research is carried out within a bigger project called Embrace, Overcoming Obstacles to Democracy in the Neighborhood. And I would like to start with a bit of a disclaimer also. So this project is a Horizon project funded by European Union, and everything that I say here reflects neither the position of European Union nor of Maastricht University. So this is purely my own experience, my own point of view, and I hope that you will, you listeners also will agree and disagree with me, I will do my best to be as clear as possible about why I think the ways things are and which way they are heading. So that's just a small disclaimer. So EU democracy promotion, Belarus, and done from Maastricht.
So speaking of Belarus, maybe you can tell us a bit about the outcome of the elections. When we were speaking in Poland, we said that maybe arguably the results are going to be pretty predictable and nothing much is going to change, or maybe they're going to change for the worse. So what is your opinion on that? And can you maybe update us on what's happening there?
So these elections are the first since the fraudulent elections in 2020. Some of the listeners might remember this, that in 2020 you had the fraudulent presidential elections in which the only president that Belarus has known so far, Mr. Lukashenko, he was re-elected, but with results that were fabricated. So in response to that, people went to the street. It was a revolution, an uprising, a political crisis, whatever you want to call it. It was the largest mobilization in Belarusian history. Following massive repressions against the people who stood up against Lukashenko, many people fled abroad or moved simply because they saw no way to make a life anymore in Belarus. And these elections are the first elections since those events, since those very critical events. And in the past 4 years, we've seen Belarusian society subjected to repression, to fear culture, to political jailings, you name it. They are also the first elections since the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine, in which Belarus, or at least the regime of Belarus, not Belarusian people, are siding with Russia. So this is a bit the context of those elections, and the elections that happened last week, over the course of that week, were to, what we can call a parliament, but it's not really a parliament, and you elect people that are nominally part of a party, but those parties are not real political parties. So, as I mentioned, Belarus is dictatorship. The outcome of the election is fixed because all the people that run for this election, they are kind of handpicked by Lukashenko and his circle. So just to give you some facts about this election is that there were no independent observers from outside Belarus or outside countries, so no OSCE mission, for instance. Instead, there were 10,000 strong security forces composed of Wagner mercenaries. Who remembers Wagner? Composed of youth clubs that work with the regime alongside regular security forces. Furthermore, for instance, it was not allowed to take a picture of your vote. So this used to be a way of expressing dissent, that you vote against all. this is no longer possible because if you made a picture and you post this online, you can go to jail. And finally, for instance, the curtains were removed from the voting booth. So people could just see what you were voting and would make sure you vote correctly. Also, if you wouldn't go to vote, this meant that when you work for a state company or you're somehow related to a state institution, it could mean that you lose your job, your place in the student dormitory, your place at your studies. So yeah, students, state employees were pressured to vote to make an artificially high outcome of the turnout of the election. And also, actually, this parliament does not have any formal power since basically the end of the 90s. So since Lukashenko changed the constitution already then. What might be interesting for the listeners, and then I will stop about the elections, is that actually they are important in some way because from these elections, there will be a new body appointed. And this is called the All Belarusian People's Assembly. It sounds a bit Soviet, but this body was made in 2023, or at least the constitution was altered in 3 to create this body, which is kind of, this is an institution where, let's say, everyone from society is represented. So political entities, companies, all kinds of councils about social issues, etc., 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 judges, for instance. And the first president of this assembly would be the current president of Belarus, or at least according to himself, the current president of Belarus, Lukashenko. And this assembly is kind of a way out for Lukashenko after he, let's say, finishes his term as president, as ruler of Belarus. I shouldn't call him a president. And this is a way for him to remain in power, albeit a bit from the background. Mm-hmm. So this is called this All Belarusian People Assembly. And Lukashenko, of course, he's looking for a way out. He knows people are not happy with him. He knows Russia can lose in Ukraine. And that would mean that he needs a way out. And this election and then the appointment of this body can be his way out. But that's for the future to tell. So I think, yeah, these elections show indeed that Lukashenko is very much still in power, that he wants to show that he's in power, that he's still in control. He signals this both to the people, you do not have a choice, and to Russia, to Putin, saying, look, I'm still in control. I'm a reliable partner who can do these kind of mass events to control this society. So, yeah, that's about the elections.
Okay.
Bit long story, but yeah,
very
I think
informative.
yeah, I think it's good for the people to know because Belarus is rather unknown country for many people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very informative. Thank you. And I wanted to come back to the idea you mentioned that a lot of people, a lot of Belarusians fled the country or just sought opportunities elsewhere, or just maybe the living there was insufferable maybe. Can you tell us a bit about the Belarusian diaspora? Where did it go? Where is it residing? I know that there's a significant Belarusian diaspora in Poland and maybe also Lithuania, right? So maybe can you tell us a bit about how the Belarusian diaspora spread around the EU countries maybe?
Yes, of course. So indeed, the diaspora from Belarus is quite significant because Belarus is a country of about 10 million, just under 10 million people. But just alone in Poland, you have 300,000 people. And there are, let's say, guesstimations, about the size of this diaspora. And I would say it's about 500,000 people. So that's 5% of the people that are from Belarus. Yeah, they live abroad. Yeah, 500,000 from 10 million. However, when you look at what kind of people these are, it's a diverse group, first of all. Their political views are not uniform. They are diverse. But what they have in common is that, generally speaking, these are people with a lot of social capital. So it is entrepreneurs, students, academics, people who used to work for state institutions but defected in 2020. So this diaspora is kind of a brain drain for the country, for Belarus. And
they are spread across Europe, across the EU continent. Some of them are actually double refugees that fled in 2020 to Ukraine and had to flee again in 2022 to the EU.
Yeah.
And similarly, there are Belarusians in Georgia because it's easier to travel there with Belarusian passport. And like you said, there is a significant group also in Lithuania, although it is increasingly harder for people from Belarus to go to Lithuania with increased activity of the Secret Service of Belarus, which is still the KGB. It was not reformed after 1989, and it's still the KGB, and they are increasingly active in Lithuania, but also in Poland. And yeah, so these are people that come from all kinds of walks of life, but indeed, and they moved for many reasons. I would say a lot of them moved for political reasons also. Either they do not agree with the regime, or indeed they protested in 2020 and afterwards and had to flee. And I think this is quite important to say that sometimes from Western Europe perspective, we look at Belarus and we see this country that is fighting alongside or at least sides with Russia in the war against Ukraine. And we think, we cannot let them in. But there is this extra dimension of that these people are kind of political refugees. Yeah, their lives are in danger. Their property is in danger. It is confiscated by the regime and auctioned off to, let's say, loyal Secret Service people that are executing these repressions on the society. So it's a group that requires a bit more, let's say, reflection on how we approach these people, because you cannot just put them in the same basket as people from Russia. You cannot put them in the same basket as the regime of Belarus. But on the other hand, this is a very capable group. You cannot approach them as someone who had to leave everything behind and arrives with nothing but a backpack. And here maybe it's important about the approach, because when the European Union approaches people from Belarus, we should take their own perspective very much into account. These people have lived under dictatorship, some of them their whole lives, and they know exactly what you can and cannot do. They know exactly how to navigate the system. And I think it's very important that we tap this potential, this social capital that is in the diaspora, in order to, at some point, bring about a change inside Belarus.
Mm-hmm. And how has the EU approached this situation so far? Whether it be with the diaspora fleeing or whether it be the regime itself, Belarus itself?
So there is no unified EU approach towards the people. People went to Lithuania and Poland mostly because there they were allowed to go.
Okay.
As a Belarusian, you couldn't just go to the Netherlands, for instance, unless you had a very strong story.
Okay.
So Poland had this program for IT people that they could easily move to Poland, and this was a way in which many people gained access to the country, even though they were also political refugees or political migrants at the same time, opposing the regime in Belarus. But there was no, let's say, mechanism like that had been triggered with Ukraine, that all Ukrainians could come and could freely move around the EU. No, this was not in place.
Uh-huh.
So this is one of the ways in which people came with this business visa, or student visa.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was possible. But this is still an issue. For Belarusians, they face this issue of legalizing their stay in the EU, as they are safe here to a certain degree.
I want to maybe go back to the point where you said that the EU does not have a uniform approach to Belarusian population, but does it have a uniform approach to Belarus as a regime or as a state or an authority? Because a few days before the elections on the 19th of February, the EU released its new council conclusions, like a strategy towards Belarus, if I'm not mistaken. Can you maybe tell us what this means? Does it situate the EU in a certain position towards the regime? And what difference does it make in this situation?
Yes, so that's a very good question. The council conclusions are the conclusions of the Council of the EU. where the ministers of foreign affairs of the EU member states gather and make a common position of the European Union towards a third country, in this case, Belarus. So when we talk about council conclusions, these are the conclusions of internal EU negotiating and creating a common position between all the member states, in this case, vis-à-vis Belarus. Following the 2020 uprising, there were council conclusions published in October 2020, in which they condemned the outcome of the elections, called for new elections, called for the adhering of the authorities to human rights, etc., etc. And these council conclusions, they build on these. You can find them online. But I would say one important thing is that these conclusions now reaffirm, let's say, EU support for Belarusian people. So again, you differentiate between the regime and its people. And second, they also, to a certain degree, institutionalize the forms of cooperation and support of the EU with the democratic opposition of Belarus, which to a large degree had to move abroad following 2020 uprising. So this is quite interesting because it provides the basis for democratic actors related to Belarus, be they in Vilnius, be they in Warsaw, to cooperate with the EU for this goal of making Belarus democratic. And again, you can find these conclusions also online.
When you mention democratic actors, do you mean basically the diaspora that's left over time? Is it only those groups, or is it larger in terms of civil society groups? What's the general makeup of these organizations when you define it as democratic actors?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's also part of my research that I look actually who and what these kind of people and organizations are. So it's good that you mentioned civil society, because it's to a large degree civil society actors that do projects, that make projects, first inside the country, now outside, that are related to almost anything that you can think of when you think about civil society. These can be student rights. These can be nature and climate issues. This can be local handling of, waste, you name it. And in an environment such as there is in Belarus, everything that you do when it comes to mobilization for a cause, for a human right, for a local issue becomes political, thereby becomes dissent, thereby you are an enemy of the regime, thereby you can go to jail, or you are sought after by the security services. So indeed, this civil society organization either went underground in the country or had to move abroad. Next to these civil society organizations, you have, let's say, the political actors. These are people that, for instance, ran in the 2020 elections. So the most prominent of them is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Her husband was a presidential candidate and was jailed shortly before the elections took place in 2020. And she kind of took up this candidacy. She won the elections. This much is clear by the amount of mobilization, indeed making pictures of voting cards, etc., etc. But of course, this was not allowed to be, and she was actually deported from the country, forced out of the country by the KGB. And she moved to Vilnius, and she has set up, let's say, a united cabinet, a united transitional cabinet, which is uniting kind of the democratic forces of Belarus, so the democratic opposition that used to be inside the country. They are now outside. They are mostly centered around the office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Next to that, you have also actors, for instance, from Warsaw. You have people who are active in Ukraine. They take a bit more, let's say, belligerent approach. And this is, for instance, exemplified by a regiment of Belarusian volunteers that fight alongside Ukraine against Russia. And together, these political actors, also related to all kinds of causes, from political prisoners to social issues to justice, transitional justice as well, They work also together to a large degree in what is called the Coordination Council. And this is a way where Belarusians abroad can find their kind of political platform. Yeah, so there might be elections also, online or not. They are trying to figure this out, how to run an election from exile for this Coordination Council. So not the Council of the EU, but the Coordination Council that is composed of Belarusian oppositional forces as a kind of parliament in exile. So you do not just have a government in exile, centered mostly around Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, but also a parliament in exile, as opposed to the fake elections to the House of Representatives in Belarus. So these are kind of the actors, yeah? People that are related to civil society, just people from all kinds of walk of life. And then you have the more, let's say, structured, the more organized democratic opposition that is centered mostly in Vilnius and in Warsaw.
All right, so there's quite a complicated connection of different actors who are based outside of Belarus, who obviously have a stake in their own country and how they want to see it run. But maybe let's take a step back and look at it even further from an outsider's perspective and of a non-Belarusian, especially maybe let's start with some contextualization of the general area. So we've got Belarus, we've had the election in 2020, and then now this current election that just was tallied up and delivered surprise results of the exact results we expected. But in the last few years, there's also been the Russian invasion of Ukraine that you mentioned. But this is also connected with the accession of certain countries into negotiations to become part of the European Union, specifically Moldova and Ukraine.
And Georgia.
And so maybe we should take a step back and look at why the European Union, its council, even delivers conclusions onto what is happening in Belarus and working with actors in Poland who want to change the governance structure in Belarus. Could you maybe give us a bit of a general context of how the EU interacts with this area?
Mm-hmm.
From
Yeah,
Belarus
certainly.
down to Georgia.
Yeah, no, that's a very good remark, and I think it's quite valuable for our listeners to know a bit more about the general region. So, without going too much on a, let's say, hike here, it's maybe good to go back a tiny bit in time. With the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, the European Union was founded. 3 years earlier, in 1989, the Berlin Wall had fallen. This opened what was then known as Eastern Europe to an independent course of action. Countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia at the time, later Czechia and Slovakia, but also the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, could pick their own way forward. And already in the 90s, early 90s, it was very clear that these countries wanted to belong to NATO for security and European Union for economic reasons, civilizational reasons, to belong not to the Soviet Union or Russia, but to the West, let's say, yeah? Or at least the Central Europe, yeah? And this happened. In 2004, we had the big bang of EU expansion, and suddenly the borders of the EU were not in Germany or Austria, but they were between Poland and Belarus, the Baltic states and Russia and Belarus, between Romania and Moldova, between Poland and Ukraine. So our direct neighbors, as European Union is a common space with open movement inside, our new neighbors were countries in Eastern Europe, the new, let's say, Eastern Europe. And these were countries like Russia, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, bordering directly the EU, but also in the South Caucasus, you had Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So 3 countries that were once part of Soviet Union and then gained their independence. And they also, to some degree, entered into some kind of relationship with the European Union. So this is the starting point. And with that came a policy that is called the European Neighbourhood Policy, which somehow set the framework of EU relations with countries in its neighborhood. So indeed, in Eastern Europe's South Caucasus, but also in the south. So the European Neighbourhood policy was then supplemented in 11 by the Eastern Partnership, EAP for short. And this was a Polish-Swedish initiative to further institutionalize EU relations with Eastern countries. What is the basis of our relationship? What are our goals? How should we govern these relationships? How should we engage with society, also with civil society? And there were 6 countries that entered this Eastern Partnership, namely Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. So these are the policy instruments.
There's a distinct lack of Russia in that grouping. Why is that the case?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the exact answer. But I think both from the European side and from Russia's side, it was clear that Russia was too big to be part of a, let's say, regional grouping that essentially had to act on the same level as a country like Armenia or Azerbaijan with the European Union. It's clear that Russia sees itself as a bigger actor and goes to great lengths to prevent countries around it to engage actually independently with the European Union. So that's why I think it was left out.
So there's this institution centered around the cooperation between the EU and various of its eastward neighbors, with the exclusion of Russia because, well, of multiple reasons, but one of them is it's just too big to fit into such a grouping. But how does an institution like this organize? How does it actually function? What are the institutional ways they cooperate between Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the EU then?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would like to start by saying that actually this is a platform, the Eastern Partnership, in which countries themselves, so the Eastern Partnership member countries, the 6, initially expressed their desire to formalize this relationship and to work together as a bloc, so the 6 plus the EU. Also, at least on paper, there is equality between the EU and the Eastern Partnership state. Like in diplomatic relations, no matter if the President of the United States visits Luxembourg, there is equality in the relations. So both have their flag represented. Both are allowed to speak the same time. Both can bring things to the table, what they want to discuss. So this is the basis, let's say, of the relationship, equality, at least nominally, between the EU and, let's say, Armenia. The Eastern Partnership is governed with a certain number of things. I would like to highlight 2. One are, let's say, treaties between the European Union and the country in question. These are bilateral, where they say, in this next few years, we will work on closer cooperation on transport. You will get free visas to come to the EU at least for 90 days. We will address the issue of LGBT rights in, let's say, Azerbaijan, etc., etc. This is a negotiation process that has been researched many times, and you can find many, let's say, academic articles. If you want to look on Google Scholar, you just type in EU EAP negotiations, something like this. Another level that I think is very important when you look at Belarus and when you look at democracy and democracy promotion is EU cooperation, EU support with civil society from those countries. So civil society from Armenia, Belarus, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, they all come together in an Eastern Partnership civil society forum where they exchange best practices, how to continue your work even when there is a dictatorship, even when there is repression against you, and they institutionalize links between EU policymakers and civil society actors on the other hand. And this is very important when it comes to Belarus, because, like I said, civil society actors are, in a way, political actors, by choice or not, had to move abroad, and they need access to funds. They need to run their projects. They need to stay alive, so when there is change in Belarus, they can come back and continue their work for the whatever cause they are there. And here it's very good for those civil society actors to have a platform where they can directly talk with EU representatives and member state representatives who are then working at that Eastern Partnership level.
I have a question. I don't know if I understood correctly, but so the Eastern Partnership was those countries' idea to form a bloc to have relations with the EU, or to make it easier? Did I get that right?
No, it's a EU initiative.
Okay.
But the countries themselves were willing
To form a bloc.
to enter this partnership as a kind of bloc.
Okay.
However, it was very clear from the beginning that engagement would be different with some countries.
Yeah.
And I think, over the years, you've seen, for instance, that Armenia is very willing to engage further with the EU than, let's say, Azerbaijan.
Yeah, actually, on that point, how has it then changed over time? So it came about in around 2011. A lot has happened since then, to put it lightly. How does it differ now between 2011 and now in 2024? How does the Eastern Partnership still function? And how has the relationship changed briefly between, for example, the EU, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia? How do they interrelate too? Because, I mean, there has been multiple wars since then fought between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So could you maybe zoom in there for a second, and then we'll see in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus again?
Yes, of course, and you're absolutely right. This is not a partnership that has not changed since 2011. In fact, it's gone through various iterations. First and foremost, indeed, there have been wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So with the representatives of the state, it might be ministers or, let's say, bureaucrats from Armenia and Azerbaijan, it was very difficult to work together in the Eastern Partnership. However, for civil society, for them, while it is of course difficult to work, let's say, as an Armenian with someone from Azerbaijan, maybe purely because there is this whole context of the war, your goal might be the same. Yeah, you are against the war, you want democratic change in your country, so this allows you still to cooperate. So at civil society level, these wars might not have such a strong effect. So there, the Eastern Partnership still provides for a good platform. When it comes to Georgia, and it's the same more or less for Ukraine and Moldova, is that it's important to realize that these countries are now EU accession countries. So they entered into EU accession talks, or at least they were allowed to enter into these talks.
So in short, they've started negotiations to become member states of the European Union.
Exactly.
So they're now in a similar position to Western Balkan countries who have already started the process of accession negotiations and are now basically on bilateral relations with the European Union, negotiating one thing after another to make sure that everything aligns so they can integrate into the European Union, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. And for them, for those three, again, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, it doesn't make a lot of sense to stay at the level of Eastern Partnership engagement because it is lower. It is lower form of cooperation than when you are about to become an EU member, naturally. Yeah, so for them, again, on the political level, they have kind of surpassed the Eastern Partnership. And of course, the war in Ukraine threw a huge spanner in the works there. But I think it shows us also the importance of institutionalizing relations, not just with the political actors, but also with society, in order for us to know, for us as EU, to know what people there need and how we can support this.
And then that brings us back to where we started this conversation of Belarus, where they've been kicked out, if I'm not wrong, or suspended anyway, yet the civil society platform still functions. So you've got this kind of two-prong situation for Belarus and the EAP.
Exactly. They have not been suspended, rather they suspended themselves. So the Belarusian authorities or regime, they retracted in 2021 from the Eastern Partnership.
So that was just after the presidential election.
Yeah. So, of course, this election came with sanctions from the EU. And yeah, Belarus just withdrew its representation from the Eastern Partnership, at least from a political level. However, this allowed also for the EU to double down on its relations and institutionalizing relations between the EU and civil society, exactly as you say. And these are to a high degree institutionalized. But for instance, it is still the case that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, as, let's say, president-elect of Belarus, and her team are not represented at the political level.
And what does that mean exactly?
So again, I talked about this political level and civil society level.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that on a political level, there is no cooperation within the Eastern Partnership between the EU and Belarus. Everything, at least what we know, takes place on this civil societal level. And it is there that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, even as a political actor, is represented.
Okay. So technically speaking, where does the democracy promotion figure into this whole equation? Is this partnership, Eastern Partnership, made for these particular goals? And does the democracy promotion figure into these negotiations, or does it also function on a civil and a political level? Where does it figure in this relation?
That's a very complicated question.
You've already talked about how there's the political level and the civil society level, right? So if I understand you correctly, the democracy promotion, it functions in two ways. On the one hand, you work politically with the different Eastern Partnership member countries to push through reforms, to change certain ways of maybe dealing with each other, to open up certain pathways for then facilitating civil society cooperation. And then on the other hand, these platforms to cooperate on a civil society level and to promote civil society engagement in democratic processes then also allows for the change on a social, maybe cultural, and even an effective level. So you've got this engagement with the civil society on the civil society platforms, and then you have the political engagement, which is much more state-focused and, legally focused. And so would you say that that kind of encompasses the idea of democracy promotion then as a strategy almost?
Yeah, I think you're very right in pointing out indeed that it is often a two-way track. Yeah. So for democracy, you need a few things to be in place. You need the institutions, you need the correct institutional framework, let's say free courts, an independent parliament that is not too connected with the executive branch, or at least can effectively control the executive branch. You need free elections, you need free media, you need all these freedoms that we here in Western Europe kind of take for granted. And second, you need a society that is aware that these rights and duties exist, that you can go to the polls, that it should make a difference, and that when your rights are infringed upon, that you can go through this institutional framework and challenge this infringement of your right. And the first track, so this institutional track, indeed, it is with political actors. You go as EU representative to, let's say, Armenia, and you say, look, there are some problems in the independence of the judges. Please change this. Yeah, but it is a please change this. You cannot say you have to change this, because this is on a bilateral basis. This is an equal relationship, let's say. And at the same time, as the EU, you can support civil society organizations which address exactly these kind of issues of judicial independence, of human rights, civil rights. It can be a support for, indeed, education, that if education is strengthened, and presumably education is then not propaganda, like it is in Belarus or in Russia, then this education will instill some kind of, let's say, social capital and awareness in the population that, yeah, we have a democracy and we should keep this, or at least maybe we are not a democracy, but we should strive to be one.
When you take it all together, it's large overlapping mess, as most things are. You said in one way there's engagement between on the political level between the EU and these individual countries, where it's a bit of a give and take. Because like, if you want to increase engagement with us, we'd ask you to ensure the independence of your judiciary, right? Or increase or allow for a more diverse liberal press, things like this. But is it not also almost a way of masquerading influence campaigns to increase the reach of Western countries into this area? And specifically, the big difference between, for example, Poland or Romania joining the European Union after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the USSR is those were not members of the USSR. They were Warsaw Pact countries who then chose to go. But in this case, it is a very different historical context, right? These are actual areas that were in the Soviet Union, that were part of the country, and from a Russian perspective, probably should still be part of the country. In what way is this almost imperialism in sheep's clothing that is just another way of expanding the European Union even more?
Yeah, I think you touch on a very important point here, because indeed, sometimes democracy promotion by the EU gets the kind of accusation that indeed it is just imperial hegemony of values. So we are trying to externalize values that are there for us, yeah? And those people outside the EU, they do not know what those values are, so we have to tell them how it works, and that if they do that, then all will be fine. But hold on, you will not get EU membership because you're a bit too far away, yeah? So this is kind of, you have to do what I say, but you get very little in return. And this is, I think, an often heard critique, indeed, by scholars, not only by scholars, but also by the countries themselves, societies themselves, regarding the EU, that, yeah, it takes this kind of paternalistic approach, bit condescending approach, where I disagree with you politely, is that, yes, these countries that we mention used to be part of Soviet Union. But in the past 30 years, these countries have developed their own statehood, their own society, to a large degree, their own society that is not so much connected with the Soviet Union anymore. That in fact, we in the West, especially in Germany, France, big countries that are comfortable in dealing with Russia because we are both great powers, yeah, or what they call in Germany, Russlandversteher, yeah, Russia understander, or that you understand the perspective of Russia. I think this does not fly anymore. Russia has proven itself to be an imperial power of its own. It just took the annexation of Crimea and 10 years of hybrid war and a full-scale invasion in 2022 to convince Western European countries that Russia is in fact an imperial power, that it wants to broaden the borders of the Russian Empire in whatever form. Be this an actual Russian Empire under the Tsars, be this a Soviet Union in which nominally nations were equal, but in fact it was, especially with the advent of World War II, a kind of Russian nationalizing enterprise in which cultures, peoples, languages were repressed in favor of, let's say, Sovietism. And finally, in the form of the Russian Federation, which goes back to this imperial tradition of the Russian Empire and very much justifies its war in Ukraine based on the fact that Ukraine is not a state on its own, it's an artificial creation. And indeed, they were part of Soviet Union, so they were part of Russia. I think we should really let go of this and look for agency, look for initiative in the countries themselves. These countries can chart their own course. And they have proven to do so over the past 30 years. The Eastern Partnership is one example of that. And here I think it is very useful when we look as, let's say, Western Europe to the approach that Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia took in the 1990s. They said, look, we were part of the Eastern Bloc, albeit not part of Soviet Union. We are our own entity and we will course our own path. And our choice is to be with the European Union. And something similar is going on nowadays, just 1,000 kilometers more east. Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia saying we are no longer part of this post-Soviet sphere. We want to be part of the European Union and we are part of the European continent. It is more complicated when you look at Azerbaijan, for instance. They have a different approach. They do not desire to be part necessarily of this European continent. But Armenia, in the past few years, has very much signaled willingness to be closer to the EU than to Russia. Because Russia, for Armenia, is no longer a credible ally. And with Belarus, finally, it is very complicated. Because Belarus, Lukashenko and his regime, were always trying to be somewhere in between the EU and Russia. Because Lukashenko knows, if I'm too close to Russia, there will be no longer a Belarus. But if I'm too close to the EU, Russia will take Belarus by force. And since 2020, he's been forced to throw all his eggs in the basket of Putin, because Putin is keeping him in power with loans, with security forces, with propaganda material, etc., etc. Plus, he's a co-belligerent in Ukraine. The civil society, or at least the coordination council that I mentioned earlier of the Belarusian democratic forces, said that they want Belarus to be part of Europe. They see this, as they write in their statement, that Europe is a space for social and civilizational security. What does this mean? It means that the Belarusian nation, with its language, its culture, and its heritage, and its people, can thrive freely inside the European Union, but not in the camp of Russia. It means that, and this goes for the entire region in the end, and I think this approach, it's very much my observation, and I know it is not shared by everyone in Europe. And it shouldn't be shared because we need to debate about this. But I would like to pose here the position that indeed there is maybe some imperialism on the European side. But when you contrast this to Russian imperialism, what do you see? Russian imperialism means you are invaded, you lose your right to your own country, to your own language, to your own history. You are a subject of whatever Russia has in store for you.
But that means that for the countries of that region and the Eastern Partnership have a case of either-or situation, right? Like, so you either go that way or this way. So where is the agency really in their existence as nations on their own for creating their own systems of governance? And if we say, of course, it's different for each state of this partnership. In Belarus, it's very complicated and it's just a very particular situation for every country, right? But when we say that these countries are saying or showing the sentiment that they want to be part of the European Union, is that also a product of democracy promotion?
I don't think we can give European democracy promotion so much credit that indeed this was the fundamental thing that changed their perspective. Mm-hmm. This was always in the countries themselves. Here it is about freedom. Freedom in the Central European sense of the word. To all people from Central Europe who are listening now, when you think about freedom, it is not just the freedom of yourself every day to do what you want, but it's also the freedom of your country, that you are not ruled by something. You are not ruled from far away. This is why Euroscepticism can be very powerful in countries like Hungary and Poland, because you say, oh, this is no longer freedom, we are being ruled from Brussels. So indeed, there is almost no choice, no room for maneuver for these countries. Either you go with Russia nowadays and you are involved in a war against Ukraine, or you choose to belong to the West, to the EU, to, let's say, a European civilizational space, as the Belarusian opposition called it, but also what the countries in the 90s said. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they said, we want to be part of the West, we want to be part of Europe. This is where we belong. We do not belong in the Russian camp. And this means that for us here in the West, we need to come to the understanding that there are no buffer zones anymore. We can no longer keep Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova comfortably between us and Russia as a kind of shock absorber. We need to provide them also this choice. We need to be there for them to make this choice, because otherwise, what is all this democracy promotion for? Then it doesn't serve a purpose. if countries themselves, if societies themselves say, we want to be, at least to some degree, follow your model of development, your model of governance, and other countries are disallowing this, we should give them a real perspective of this. But again, it took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 for this to happen. Then it was very quickly arranged. Von der Leyen was in Kiev. It was signed all pretty very clear, very quickly. Yeah, at least first declaratory. Ukraine is part of Europe and we cannot allow it to lose. And now, finally, indeed, they have been granted candidate status. With Belarus, it's different. The country, or at least its rulers, are firmly in the Russian camp, while its society is not firmly in the Russian camp, but also not yet firmly, let's say, in the European camp. They still are somewhere in between, I would say, and this is not a bad thing. This is up to Belarusian people to resolve somehow. Where do they belong? And I think as the war in Ukraine progresses, as repressions in Belarus continue, I think you can say that there is some kind of imperialism from Europe, but its imperialism takes another form, a way different form than Russian imperialism. Yeah, it's maybe bureaucratic and it's maybe difficult for those countries to adopt these reforms and it costs them, but it's either this or you lose your entire statehood and indeed your right to exist as a country, as a culture, as a language, or even as an individual.
I think that's a good point to end on. I think you also summarized our discussion quite well there, so thank you very much. That brings us to our last segment of this podcast.
Our favorite segment.
Yeah. And that is for people who did listen to sit through this whole thing and found it an interesting discussion, where they can go to explore more on, democracy promotion, civil society, or specifically Belarus. And you said you've brought us some, I think mostly reading material, but I think also something to watch, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, so exactly, and I think it's very important that you don't engage just on politics. It's about much more than that. Freedom is freedom to be yourself. It's to express yourself in whatever ways you want. So for that, I think when it comes to Belarus, there are two books that I read and I brought here today. Here you can hear them. That's them. The first one, it's in German. So to all our German readers out there, it's by Olga Szparaga. She is a Belarusian philosopher and women's rights activist, let's say. And she wrote a book about the 2020 uprising called The Revolution Has a Female Face. And in German, Die Revolution hat ein weibliches Gesicht. And this is basically a feminist account of that revolution. Very interesting. I think an atypical perspective on that. And certainly worth reading. And I read it with great pleasure, even though my German is not so good. Second, I brought a bit bigger book. This is by Ruslan Soshin. It's in Polish, but maybe there is an English translation on the way. However, if you read Polish or another Slavic language, you should read Icebreaker, Swiatlana Tichanuskaya, or in Polish, Łodołamaczka, Swiatłana Tichanuska. And this is an account of the 2020 uprising of Ruslan, who was following Swiatlana Tichanuskaya in her steps. So it's basically a diary of what happened in 2020. And finally, there is a very nice movie called Viva Belarus. Viva Belarus. You can find this on YouTube. And it's basically an account of a guy that goes into the Belarusian army. He's drafted into the army and he has all kinds of experiences there in this dictatorial system, and where army is about repression. And it's actually shot in Warsaw. So if you are from Warsaw, you will see many familiar sights. So yeah, 2 books, 1 movie. And finally, check New Eastern Europe. And this is a, let's say, publishing house, and they recently published a series of articles about Belarus.
Right. Thank you so much. Of course, for those who listen to Understanding Europe more, they already know that we're gonna link this in the description and put all the names of the material that Wicke suggested. So thank you, Wicke, for the interesting reads and also movie that you suggested. And I want to thank you again for being with us today and making the time for recording this episode. And thank you so much for the insightful information. And everyone who's listening to us, thank you for tuning in for episode 1 of season 2. And stay tuned for episode 2, where we discuss the democracy promotion in the Southern Neighbourhood. So, talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
This episode was recorded, edited, and fully produced by Brendan Hogan and Charelle. The music was produced by Stone Ocean. Thank you for listening.